lunch. There is more pizza since the folks dropped 2 boxes, so anyone who's still hungry and didn't feel like they got enough, you can. I don't think this gentleman will mind if you went down and got yourself a pizza and went back to your seat, right?
Right.
Right, because you can tell he's flexible because he is Chaplain Darwin Huartson. I got to get that right. Not Huartson. Huartson, even better. Huartson, are Swedish by any chance? Oh, I love it. Anyhow, he is here from Vitas Hospice, and that means he has a very interesting role in his job. You know, we've had a little bit of conversation with some of our speakers about spirituality in late life and how is it different from your generic older person and the person who is in a hospice situation. I think one of the things that we as healthcare practitioners do our best at avoiding is addressing in any way, shape, or form spiritual issues with our patients. People are uncomfortable with doing that with our patients, and that's why you have someone like a chaplain come and talk to you to get you more comfortable with those kinds of things. And in fact, our physicians over in our geriatrics area look forward to getting this kind of presentation because they want to get more comfortable. And it's a necessary part of life, and if you run away from it, you're not doing as much as you can to help your patients, especially when they need to talk. So, go for it. Thank you so much.
Well, it is indeed a pleasure to be with you today. And I've been a chaplain for, I guess, about 9 years. Prior to that, I was a parish pastor. And so I've had a variety of ministry sites. I've been in the parish, I've been in the hospital, and I've been with hospice. I guess I used to say that my ministry was 4 weddings and a funeral. Now it's 4 funerals and a wedding. But spirituality has always been an important part of what I do. But I must share with you that my own view of spirituality has changed so much in the time period that I have worked, especially in the hospital and the hospice realm. And so it's a pleasure to be with you today, and I hope that we can be interactive. There's some things I'd like to ask you to share, and I hope that this can be a time of exchange between all of us. So what are the things that we want to talk about today? I'd like to make sure that we're able to define the difference between spirituality and religion. I would say that every one of us in this room are spiritual people. I'm not sure every one of us in this room are religious people. And sometimes they're very similar, sometimes they're different, and we'll have a chance to talk about that. To describe the role of the caregivers and health caregivers in helping others maximize spiritual energy. One of the things that I think so many people think about when they think of me as a chaplain working with hospice is that I work with spiritual energy. That is very true, but our entire team are responsible for spirituality. And sometimes it's the CNA, sometimes it's the nurse, sometimes it's the volunteer who makes the connection with the person on a spiritual level. And sometimes, you know, as a chaplain, the best thing I can do is get out of the way and let that other person connect, because that's what's important and what's essential. I hope today, too, to reflect on the developmental needs of older adults and how it relates to our spiritual journey. This past weekend, a friend of mine turned 60, and I hosted a party for him. I invited him to this conference today, but somehow he just didn't think that was very funny. So spirituality and our older years. Needless to say, I don't know if you thought it was very funny either. To identify spiritual distress and how to respond to it. We all at times become distressed. And many times it's a spiritual distress, especially when we are connecting with people who are hurting on many levels. My guess is that as you have looked at the broad spectrum this week, you've seen how we connect with people, and especially older people, on an emotional, physical, and spiritual level. And sometimes when the physical isn't working, there's a spiritual distress component to that. And finally, we want to talk about hope, because hope is essential for us to live. And our definition of hope changes. What I hoped for 5 years ago certainly isn't what I hope for today. And if you're diagnosed with a disease, if you're diagnosed with cancer, what you hope for maybe today and 5 years or 1 month may change a lot as well. And as spiritual caregivers, we can help people define what hope is for them. I think one of the things that's so essential if we are going to be spiritual caregivers is to explore what spirituality means to us as individuals. And one of the ways that we can do that is just to ask some significant questions. What are some words that come to mind when you think or you hear the word spirituality? Silence isn't always golden.
Silence.
What's that?
Silence.
Silence? Okay. Good timing on that one.
Transcendence.
Transcendence? Okay.
Peace.
Peace? Okay.
A connection with the higher being.
Okay, a connection with the higher being. Okay.
I don't know why hope comes to mind.
Hope. Okay. Okay. And words that come to mind today may not be the words you think of tomorrow. I think spirituality is always evolving for us. But I think it's one of those words that connects us. That's the word that I think of when I think of the word spiritual. Connected to something bigger than myself, whatever that might be. One time in my life when my faith or belief system was challenged. If not for yourself, think of the people that you would probably serve, or older folks that you know. What would be one time that their belief system was challenged? Death, okay. Okay, when you find out that you have a terminal disease, okay.
Just on anybody that's ill for any reason, that it's more than just, on the shoulder, anything as far as strength.
Right. I remember a gentleman saying, I always prayed that God would take care of my little girl, and then when she got hurt, it's like that belief system, all of a sudden, it's like, what do I do with that? And so at times, our belief system is really confronted by things that happen to us in our life. And I think that's what's important when we're connecting with people, to listen for that. One question that my faith or belief system that has never satisfactorily answered for me, I think it's along that same wavelength. All of a sudden you're on a different terrain. All of a sudden it's like, gosh, I never used to doubt that. And so that is when I think we start to sometimes hear people expressing some of that spiritual distress that I had mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between spiritual needs and religious needs. Anybody want to take a shot at what a religious need would be versus a spiritual need? How many of you think of yourself as being religious people? Okay. What makes you a religious person? Conscience. Okay. Praying. Okay.
Attending church.
Okay. Okay. Okay, how is that different than a spiritual need? Or maybe it's the same.
I think that spiritual, for me, I feel like I'm spiritual, not religious. I think of religious as being more traditional, like a spiritual connecting with my thought process of who God is, my spiritual being, how I relate to my God. But religious would be more like tradition, like I always go to church. We do communion on this day.
Right.
We do, those are things we do, but that's part of the religious
Right.
aspect.
Okay, that's a good distinction, and I think one of the, go ahead.
But I disagree. I think a person can be extremely religious and have absolutely nothing to do with organized religion.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I think the distinction I would make between the two is that if one has religion as an important value, often it's a ritual, often it's something I do on a very regular basis. It's something I just have as part of my routine, whereas a spiritual value is much broader than that. And one of the things that I've noticed in working with people who are dying is that there are some very specific spiritual needs that people come to terms with or need to come to terms with. And I think those spiritual values are always there for all of us, but I think they get peaked when we are pushed in the corner, when all of a sudden we're dealing with our limitations. The whole sense of the meaning of life. What's this about? Why is this happening? And I think so often, even in studies that were done, with people who survived in the Nazi camps, what kept them alive, so to speak, was a meaning for what was happening to them. So I think people are always seeking to find meaning in not only their life, but the legacy that they will leave as a result of their life. Hope, as we mentioned, just a real important element. What happens if people don't have hope? Depression. Okay. And I think that is so present among so many elderly people. I remember my dad said, well, what do I have to look forward to? And again, when they're asking those questions, I think what's important for us as caregivers is to help reframe that question and help them define what is it that you have to look forward to. I think we're so tempted to answer that for them, and that's not really helpful, but I think what's helpful is when we can help reframe it and help them discover that for themselves. Dignity. How many times haven't I heard a family member say, I know that this death is essential and it comes for all of us, but I want my loved one to die with dignity. And I think that's an important spiritual value that people have. How many of us don't feel that need to be connected with people who really care about us? And I know that when we were looking at facilities to put my father in, I remember that was one of the things that we were always asking about. Are there people here that will care for him and show him the dignity and love that he deserves and that we expect? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what are some of the religious needs. Rituals, and I think you've mentioned some of them, communion, prayer. And for some people, that ritual is so important, it's just kind of like if that isn't there, then something is missing. So I think this is where, if we're religious people, I think sometimes this is how it can connect with spirituality. But I agree, one can be very, very spiritual and not necessarily religious. But I do believe each of us have that component to be spiritual beings, especially if we base spirituality on those significant items that are listed there. For some, as I've said before, religion and spirituality go hand in hand. For others, they are viewed as separate. They aren't even necessarily connected. I think many people are spiritual and not religious. I also have discovered in the work that I do is that as people get older, sometimes if they were connected with a church or a synagogue, sometimes as they get older, that isn't as important because they're not able to go anymore. And so all of a sudden, their religious needs are minimized where their spiritual needs, I think, are still there. Some people feel alienated from the institutionalized religion. And our task as caregivers is to be non-judgmental about what it is that they consider to be important. If there's one thing that I insist on when we train volunteers for hospice, is that they are in touch with their own spirituality, but they also are aware that in our work, if we are aware of people trying to convince people to believe the way someone else believes, we don't want them working with us, because that's not what it's about. We're connecting people to help people get in touch with their own spiritual resources. Even our chaplains, I'll tell people, you know, I want you to have a strong spiritual identity. I want you to know who you are when you go into that room to visit that person. But once you're there, what's important is to remember to help that person get in touch with their own spiritual resources, because their spiritual resources is what's going to help them make it through the long haul. So how do we provide spiritual support? Sometimes I think we might be overwhelmed when we hear people expressing some of their distress, but I've discovered that there are some very specific ways that we can be helpful. One of them is through active listening. What does active listening suggest? What are we letting the person know when we're listening? That we're engaged and that we're hearing what they're saying. And what we're listening for is content, but we're also listening for feelings. If we can express to them that we're hearing their anguish or their fear or whatever it is they're expressing, that's called active listening. I think one of the temptations sometimes for us is to answer tough questions. Tough questions like, Chaplain, why is this happening to me? Chaplain, why did my daughter have to suffer so much? And it's not only chaplains that get asked that question, but all of us do. And I think the important thing is not to answer the question, but to hear the question and to live the question. Being non-judgmental and tolerant, allowing others to express feelings, helping others to find meaning in life by looking at their accomplishments. A big thing in hospice that we do a lot of is life review. But I'm convinced that before my father died, even before he was on hospice, he was at that stage in his life where life review was an important component of his spirituality. It was an important part of knowing that his life had value by being able to review it with someone. And sometimes, you know, we say, oh, how many times do I have to hear that story? And yet, that story is so important. And I think so often we are fortunate if we're the ones that are chosen to hear those stories. Provide support, but don't fix or solve spiritual issues. That's tempting sometimes. You know, let me tell you how to do it. If you just, even I think sometimes if we have a strong spiritual base ourselves, we have to be careful about giving God advice, because, you know, telling them that God's going to fix it isn't necessarily what they need to hear. So, what are some threats to spirituality, especially with older adults? Needless to say, losses of all kinds. A friend of mine who worked in a nursing home said one time, she said, you know, I'm convinced that the reason a lot of these people probably are perceived as grumpy old men is that how many losses have they had in 1 week that someone hasn't acknowledged? And I thought, boy, that's pretty accurate. So it's important to recognize that losses can be a threat to one's spirituality. Challenge value systems. Maybe someone is forced to live on less income. Someone is forced to deal with family dynamics that they didn't expect. Someone is expected or forced to deal with a son or a daughter that isn't living in the same kind of lifestyle that they thought they should. So there are many reasons that those challenges could affect someone's spirituality. Separation from religion and or culture. You know, how many times haven't I heard of someone saying, well, I'm going to bring mom out to live with us. And mom really probably even wants to do that. But once she gets here, all of a sudden, she's having to deal with, gosh, I miss my friends. I miss being able to go to the Jewish Community Center and just have coffee with the girls. You know, all of those things that we don't take for granted, but once they aren't there, I think they're very evident to us. Death of a loved one, and I like this one because loved one doesn't necessarily have to be a human being. How many people haven't lost a pet and are experiencing incredible grief over that? And being able to acknowledge and support that disenfranchised grief that people often express. Sometimes, you know, someone may be in a nursing facility and one of the individuals dies, not related to that person at all, but that loss is as significant as if it was a sibling living somewhere else. So often I think that disenfranchised grief can be a threat to one's spirituality. Personal and family disaster, bankruptcy or estrangement from a family member, changes in environmental, health, or self-concepts moving from a nursing home or struggling with an illness. Are there others that come to mind? No doubt there are many. Can you see how that would be a threat to one's spirituality, to one's well-being? So how do we listen for spiritual distress? Well, some of the spiritual indicators are just an expression of fear. I'm afraid. I don't know what the future holds. There's an elderly woman that I know from my church, and she went to the doctor 2 days ago, and she said, I know if he says that I can't drive anymore, then I'm really afraid. And I said, what are you afraid of? I'll have to leave the home that I live in. So fear becomes a real component, a real indicator of spiritual distress. Feelings of despair and hopelessness, prolonged or intense suffering, anger towards God, religion, clergy, others. When I worked in the hospital setting, I wore a clerical collar, and I remember a couple times, didn't even say hello, the guy just said, I don't want to talk to you. I represented clergy, I represented God, and I represented something that he was really having a tough time with at that time. Estrangement, probably one of the biggest needs that we see with many of our hospice patients is for people to come to terms with relationships with family members, relationships with children, relationships with God. Again, that reconciliation can take many different forms. And I've seen people who haven't talked for 30 years and, you know, they've decided, you know, enough of this. And close to the time of their death, they've come together and said, let's make peace over the issues that we probably don't even remember what they are anymore. So these are some indicators of spiritual distress. As you're connecting with people, if you hear these things, I would listen closely. So how do we help with spiritual needs? We listen empathetically. Sometimes we need to ask questions that will help further clarify what it is that they're concerned about. Avoid giving advice. and being present. One of the exercises that I often do when I'm training volunteers for hospice is to ask people to write down a time in their life when they were really, really stressed out. And who was significant, what did they say, and what did they do? And more often than not, we can remember the person, we can remember what they did, but more often than not, we don't remember what they said. And my point with that is, we so often worry that we're not going to say the right thing when somebody is really, really having a difficult time. And it's not so important to say the right thing as it is to show up, as it is to make the phone call, as it is to embrace someone. So being present, I can't stress it enough. It's so important by just giving someone your total self. There's some research that was done on a doctor that often would come to visit patients, and he basically stayed 5 minutes. But people thought that he stayed 10 or 15 because when he was there, he was fully there. He sat down, he gave his full attention, and I found that to be such an interesting statement of what it meant to be engaged and to be present with someone. So what is being present? It's listening with our whole self. It's allowing each person to have his or her own feelings, hearing the content of the message and the emotion, and it's a skill that I think we acquire. It's something that I think we can learn, and I think it's something we can get better at. Being present is not trying to solve the problem, cheering a person up, or working out our own issues. Now, all of these things, it's kind of like when you go out for dinner. If all the service is great, you don't even think so much about that you had good service. But if you go to a restaurant and you have bad service, oh my gosh, that was just terrible. And I think that's kind of how it is when we're not present. You know, we're there and all of a sudden, gosh, that person didn't give me much time. That person really didn't listen to what was important. So I think it's a skill that we definitely can develop and further develop. So what are some responses that aren't helpful as we're responding to people who have spiritual needs? Well, I think these are broad categories, but I think there's the eternal optimist who says, oh, come on, cheer up, everything will work out. Well, we know that everything doesn't work out. What are we doing to someone when we do that? Yeah, we're saying, what you're telling me right now isn't that important. Okay? Well, then there's that top thing that we do when we're uncomfortable. And this happens a lot with people, especially around grief issues, especially if they don't know how to deal with it. They'll change the subject. And a good subject that we could probably change to is, how about those spurs? You know, or how about those, whatever it is, that's something to distract us away from responding to the issues that we're hearing. Advice giving. Now, what you should do, you know, when my mother was in a facility like this, blah, 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 blah. Again, advice giving is probably not going to be that helpful. Spiritual solutions. God will take care of everything. It's helpful if the person themselves says that to us. Then I think we can respond and say, gosh, it sounds like God is really important to you. But if I get ahead of them and give that kind of advice, again, it kind of shuts them down spiritually. And I think that's the thing we don't want to do. We don't want to shut people down. And the way we embrace people is to meet them where they are. Sometimes people will say, well, what's helpful? And again, I think we all have different things that we say or do. But over the years, I guess, as I've listened to people and as I've had experience just connecting with people, especially who are struggling with grief, these are some responses that I think can be helpful. I'm sorry. I feel sad for you. How are you doing with all of this? That's an open-ended thing. It might invite them to share more. One of the most significant things that we can do sometimes is be transparent. I remember one time this person was just telling me just this incredible story, and I didn't know how to respond, so I just said, I don't know what to say. And you know, I think that was just fine, because it was honest, and it let that person know that I heard their incredible story, and he kept talking and kept talking. So I think it's okay sometimes just to say, I don't know what to say. What can I do? I'm here to listen. Please tell me what you're feeling. This must be really hard for you. And what is most difficult? So you see, it isn't so much that we give people answers, but I do think it's important to help them ask questions. And the way that they do that is by being engaged with people who do that themselves. So basically, I think each of us, I'm a chaplain, I do spiritual assessments when I go visit a patient. But I think as spiritual beings, all of us can make assessments. And I don't know if this FICA, isn't that a Social Security thing? Doesn't sound very spiritual to me. But it's an acronym that we could probably use to remember what to look for in spiritual history. Faith or beliefs, importance and influence, community, and how we address all of those things. Questions to pursue with faiths or beliefs. What is your faith or your belief? Again, as we're connecting with people, we might not just ask that the first time we meet them, but as we're engaged with them over a period of time, we can ask that question in different ways. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a religious belief. It may be a belief about family. It may be a belief about just any number of things. I think it's appropriate sometimes just to ask the question, do you consider yourself spiritual or religious? And again, when we ask that, we don't ask with an agenda. We ask to learn more. And as we are healthcare providers, I think a question that we can be asking or listening for is, what role do your beliefs play in your overall well-being? Because that's the component that spirituality does factor in. So we go to importance and influence. What's important in your life? Sometimes what we're going to hear is friends, family. Sometimes we're going to hear people say, well, the fact that I have money in the bank and I feel secure. How do your beliefs, whatever they may be, influence your thinking and behavior during difficult times? I think another way to ask that is, what's helped you in the past? What's helped you make it through a difficult time? And again, what role do your beliefs play in regarding your health? Are you part of a community? I'm convinced that no matter what age we are, we all have a need to belong. And for several years I lived in Harlingen, and boy, the community down there had so many of these trailer parks. And it was that need for people to come, many times from the north, for just 4, 5, 6 months, but there was such a need to connect with people who were similar to them. And I think that sense of just belonging was so evident. And again, some of these questions seem kind of obvious, but I think they're important questions, especially if we're trying to get an assessment of one's spiritual integrity. How would you like me, a healthcare provider, to address these issues in your life? And again, sometimes we're not going to ask that question exactly like that, but I think we're going to integrate it in how we exchange with that person when we're talking to them. So some general recommendations about when taking a spiritual history. Consider spirituality as a potential important component of every person's physical well-being and mental health. And I think so often, you know, in the last maybe 15, 20 years, there's been such an emphasis on people being holistic. And I've appreciated that because I think society is recognizing how much spirituality plays in one's well-being. We address spirituality whenever the client wants to. Sometimes they bring it up at times we would least expect. As you are in your professions, they may bring it up when they're visiting you in the office. And just taking 5 minutes with them to respond to that could be the best thing that you did for them that day. Respect a person's privacy regarding spiritual belief, and don't impose your beliefs on others. I guess a good question to ask ourselves is, how do we feel when somebody tries to tell us that our belief system isn't good enough, or that our belief system needs something else? And if that's the case for us, you can imagine that would be the case for others as well. I think it's important for us to know when we're in over our head. I think there's a time for us to make referrals to chaplains, spiritual directors, and/or community resources as appropriate. Be aware that your own spiritual beliefs will help you personally, but be careful not to impose them. As I tell the chaplains that we have 12 of them that work with us, I want you to have a strong spiritual identity, but I don't want your identity to become our patient's identity. But I want your identity to be that which empowers you to help them discover what's significant for them. So, how would you define hope? Anybody want to take a shot? If somebody said, what is hope? Hope is
Expectation.
okay, expectation. Okay. Something out here. Okay. What do people hope for? Good health? Hope it's Friday and it's time to go home after a long week? What's that?
And payday.
And payday, absolutely.
Happiness.
Happiness? Okay.
Afterlife.
Afterlife? Okay. Okay. One of the things that is important, I think, is for us is to recognize how hope for an individual can change so radically within a small amount of time. Someone is healthy, and all of a sudden they have cancer. And as a result of the cancer, one of the first things they're going to hope for is that it'll go into remission. And you know what? It does. Great. We're thankful. Then all of a sudden, they come out of remission. Now what do they hope for? Same thing, right? Okay. So then eventually, maybe it doesn't stay in remission. Then they hope to be pain-free. Then they hope to get treatments that will continue to give them quality of life. And finally, maybe they're to the point of, I hope to see my granddaughter graduate. You see how it's defined by what's going on in their life. And so it's so important for us not to project what we would hope, because it's different when we are the ones that are in those circumstances. Critical aspects of hope include expectation for the future, motivation for action, means of fulfilling goals. I had a colleague that had cancer, and he lived probably 7 years beyond what anybody expected him to live beyond. And as we look back, he, after he got cancer, he went back and got another degree. He built a house. He went to Europe. He just did so many things. He had something to live for. And so I think it's important that people recognize that hope is something people can set as a goal for themselves, and it's defined by what's going on in their life. And it's so different for each and every person. Some people may hope for a long life. Then there's people that hope that I die soon. You know, I don't want to suffer anymore. How many times haven't I heard that? Gosh, I'm ready to go. So again, there's such a variety of things that people can be wanting and desiring in that journey we call life. This quote is one of my favorites. Ken Doka is a pretty well-known bereavement person in the United States, and I attended a conference of his a couple years ago, and this was a quote that he had that I like a lot. It says, "The role of a caregiver might be compared to a candle. A candle can help illuminate an experience, provide a path in the darkness, and give courage to explore. The light can accompany individuals as they negotiate a sometimes scary and treacherous path. The journey may still be dark, but the light can make it less terrifying." And I think each and every one of us have the ability to accompany people on that scary journey. And our support, our love, our acceptance of them can make a big difference. We can't do the journey for them, but we can go with them so that it's not so frightening for them. Okay, I would be very open to some questions or comments.
I have a question.
Okay.
What if a person asks us for our advice? Should we do it?
Okay, could you give me an example?
Well, not an example, but like how you were saying that you shouldn't say, well, I would do this, or things like that,
Mm-hmm.
or what we think.
Mm-hmm.
So in a case where they ask us, I'm thinking, then you could, right?
Yeah, I think I would be very honest with them and say, it sounds like you would like me to share what I would do. And these are some things that I would do if it was me. But I think it's real important that we make that clarification. Now, again, I think it depends on the issue. If it's medical advice, I think I would say, I think you need to talk to your doctor. But if it's personal advice, I think I would claim that and I would say, well, if you're asking me, this is what I myself would do. I feel like an auctioneer.
He'll be happy to stick around until, for the next 10 minutes if you want to ask him something privately too.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and best of luck in all that you do, and continue to be wonderful spiritual human beings.
Smoking caterpillar.